Fall into this space. But I would first like to pass it to my colleague Alice, who will help kick us off.
Hey everyone, good evening, wherever you're zooming in from across the country and the world. We're so thrilled to have you here with us. Thank you to everyone who has shown up to support this work and who has been supporting the work and doing their own work and all the beautiful ways that it's needing to be done at this time. I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of everybody here at Equality Labs. And yeah, we have a lovely agenda here for you all tonight. We'll be getting into our Dalit History Month event and honoring the rich liberation traditions and solidarities between Dalit history and Black history, particularly looking into Rima's book, The Fire Inside, Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. Very much looking forward to the discussion. And with that, I will pass it back to Thenmozhi to get us into a space of grounding, and we'll jump right into a deep dialogue on that intersection.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And I think that, one of the things that we like to do before we get into some of the work that we're going to be talking about today, and Dr. Rima Vesley-Flad's beautiful book, The Fire Inside, the Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, is we do want to have a moment of collective breath and grounding. We know that people may be coming from many different places, from, perhaps organizing, maybe work, maybe doing ice monitoring. We know that this is a very challenging time, and this ability for us to be collectively together and to hold sacred space of ancestors, as well as dreaming of what comes next, is necessary and vital and a crucial part of Dalit History Month. So if everyone could just take a little moment, we're going to just ground ourselves. Ellis, if you wouldn't mind taking the slides off, I want to just be able to have people see both me and Rima embodied. Thank you. So what I'd love for everybody to do is to take their feet and put them onto the ground. Um, Let their feet kind of like hug the floor. Maybe your feet are in your shoes, or maybe they're barefoot or in socks, but really just plant them hard into the ground and find that as soon as you hug the floor, you feel the earth rising to meet you. And as you do that, just feel warm, beautiful, loving earth energy, just holding us, witnessing us, and carrying us through this beautiful conversation in these very hard, challenging times. And as you do that, take your hands and put them on your thighs, just reminding you what a strong layer of support your legs have been. And as you feel the earth energy rising up through the tops of your feet, into your legs, and into your hips, we're going to go ahead and take our first breath together. Breathing in life energy and breathing out anything that distracts you or doesn't serve you. Breathe in and breathe out. And as you do that, you feel that earth energy rising up from your hips into your torso. You may have had tension. Maybe you've been sitting too long. Maybe it's just been challenging because you've been protesting all day, or just having to wait in court, or just general tensions of life, But just let that earth energy rise up through your torso, into your solar plexus, up into your heart, and take another breath, reminding yourself that you're breathing in life and breathing out all that doesn't serve you. Breathe in and breathe out. And as you do that, you feel more ease through your torso, ease through your shoulders, Maybe so much so that you bring your shoulders up to your ears and you let your shoulders melt with breath and with the support of the earth. And suddenly you feel a little bit more present, and the fragged feelings of the day start to dissipate as you feel more in your body, your breath alive with the support of the earth. And we're going to take another breath in and let that energy go up into your head, bringing in life and releasing all that does not serve you so that you can be present for this beautiful and sacred conversation. Take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And as you do, you feel that beautiful earth energy rising up into your jaw, up behind your eyes, where maybe you've had tension because you're doom scrolling or just reading legal papers or just doing too much in the mind when we actually need to be in our body and our breath. And feel that earth energy just releasing, releasing, releasing just a little bit of tension and bringing in a little bit more ease. And as you do, we're going to do our last breath, bringing that earth energy up to the top of our head and see a little sprout coming up from the top of our head. And we're going to breathe in, reminding ourselves we're bringing in life, and then releasing all that doesn't serve us. So breathe in. Breathe out. And as you do that last breath of earth energy up through the top of your head, I want you to reach up with your mind up into the cosmos and the stars, and imagine a light from the stars that comes in and meets that tendril of earth energy. And think of that voice from the stars, that starlight, as the voice of our ancestors. And let it shimmer down into your body, giving you a shower of ancestral strength and grace, so that as you feel the strength of the earth witnessing and holding you, you also feel the rise of your own inner wisdom, imbued by the power of the space of your ancestors. For they too are here, especially for this beautiful Dalit History Month breath. And we're going to take one last breath before we begin. So let's really let this breath count. So take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Ready? We're going to open your eyes. So, J Beam and J Savitri, everyone, it's such a beautiful thing to be here. For many of us, like here at Equality Labs, we are a Dalit caste oppressed civil rights organization. And the month of April is a very powerful month because it's an opportunity for us to celebrate Dalit history. And in this month, we celebrate the strength of caste oppressed leaders from Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi communities. And it allows us to really explore the connections of our freedom movements, not just in the subcontinent, but with other leaders all across the world. And even in this volatile time, when we look at the legacy of our ancestors, it's a reminder of how much abundance we have. And that in many ways, that legacy is really the ways that we are going to continue to shape our visions of healing and justice and liberation. And this year's theme for 2026 is Seeds of Liberation. If you guys have heard of that phrase, they tried to bury us, but we were seeds. In many ways, all of our movements of oppressed peoples, we have survived the worst. We have survived genocide. We have survived enslavement. We have survived apartheid. But in many ways, the visionaries that come from our lineages, we cultivate their knowledge and we sustain our communities through their vision of how we work against dominator systems, and that the seeds of freedom that we plant today will grow for the future of our descendants. So in that spirit, we are deeply honored to be in conversation with, the inimitable and powerful and my dear friend, Dr. Rima Vesley-Flad, who is here to talk about her new book, Fire Inside, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. And our team will actually share a link to her book because we want everybody, if you haven't done so already, buy her book. But also, I think that in this moment, because many people may know of her scholarship around Black liberatory thought and Buddhist practice, but I think they may not be as familiar, Rima, with your work around how you've connected to other oppressed communities, like the Dalit community, like the Palestinian community, because of your commitment to Buddhist ethics and Black liberation. And I think that's really what drew me to your book for our conversation today. And in many ways, your thoughtful reflections in this book really gave me a lot to think about. And I think for many in our audience about how does our shared commitment to confronting suffering really become a part of the path towards boundless freedom. And so really looking forward to seeing what you have to say about it. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Thenmozhi. I'm so honored to be in conversation with you. I am your biggest fan. I teach your book when I'm teaching my Buddhist studies classes. I am really just so thrilled. And so honored that you engaged my book in a deep way. I can tell from the questions you've prepared and even the way that you've spoken just now about ancestors and vision. I really am so pleased.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, you definitely sense your ancestors. Like I kind of feel like this is not just the Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde, but really the Dharma of your family. And because I felt their spirit when I was reading this book. And, I know that there's some folks here that have read your book here that have joined us today. But I think that sometimes when you have a book that's filled with like ancestor energy, you like go through it like fire because it's like a holy experience. And the pain that you really navigated and the healing that you brought yourself in writing, I really felt that. And so it's such a gift. So thank you for writing this really beautiful book.
I appreciate that. It was a journey. For those of you who haven't read the book, much of what I talk about is the experience of hatred by my white grandparents and my journey to find my father's people. And I did, which was just a tremendous experience. So, yes, I would say my grandmother, whose name was Lucille Light, very much infused this project. And my great grandparents, who were just movers and shakers in the Delta, the Mississippi Delta, were very present as well.
Well, it was very interesting because I think for folks, there are also some folks here that are also part of the American Buddhist Sangha. And I think that, a conversation between a Black and a Dalit Buddhist is a very profound one because I feel like we bookend the promise of Buddhist vision around how being able to have Buddhist ethics really confronts dominator systems.
Yes.
And I feel like one of the lines that I really kind of stuck with me was how you really kind of talked about Audre Lorde and James Baldwin's ideas of how they both kind of really look at how to transform the poison of dominator systems, particularly that of race. And, for me as a Dalit, I could see very similar analogies with anti-caste thinkers like Dr. Ambedkar and Jyotibai Phule and Ayodhya Das, who really wrote deeply about the humiliations of caste, but refused that exclusion to still hold a vision of radical freedom. So I wanted to, as someone who just recently just did some deep thinking about this, could you talk a little bit about what is the heart of that transformation? Poison into power. And how do you see it resonating across Black and Dalit traditions of thought?
I think that's such a profound question. In sitting with it, what came to mind was this capacity to see differently. And there are two stories, one from each writer, that stand out. So with Baldwin, after high school, when he moved to Greenwich Village, he he formed a relationship with a painter, an artist named Buford Delaney. And there's a story, it's in Baldwin's biography, and he also talks about it, in which he's out in the street and there is oil in the gutter. And Buford Delaney says to him, look again. And, initially Baldwin looked and saw pollution. But when he looked again at the oil, he could see color and clouds reflected and swirling in the gutter, and the beauty of that. And it's such a poignant metaphor for what it means to look at yourself differently, because Baldwin had grown up in a household in which he was told pretty consistently that he was ugly, that he had prominent eyes, that he was an unattractive human physically. And so that idea, look again, to be able to see beauty where previously you might have seen a kind of defilement, I think was very powerful and very transformative for Baldwin. And when he moved to France at the age of 24, he stepped back and asked, what is the human condition and what is the Black experience? And he wanted to know that, and to know that very fully. And he could look at the United States and look again and see the kind of destruction that took place psychologically, also the material conditions, the poverty, the violence. And he could see the beauty of Black people. And one of the things he also talks about in interviews and essays, he talks about finding the blues. He talks about listening to the music of his people and how they could turn suffering into music, and how Bessie Smith carried him through. I think that is that process that you're talking about of turning poison into power for Baldwin. And in many ways it was similar, although she used different language, for Audre Lorde. There's a story about, and Audre Lorde talks about it continuously, about how at the age of 4 she didn't speak, and she was also legally blind. So she could see images, but from a distance, everything was blurry. But she, when she did speak, started to speak in poetry. And when she put glasses on and could see more clearly, she still had that memory of seeing the blurriness. And what stands out, what it tells me, is that here is someone who physically struggled, and yet in terms of her inner life had enormous vision. And that what was in front of her wasn't all that there is in the world. And so for Audre Lorde, there was this transcendence. And you see that in her work, you see that in her spiritual practices, which I'll talk more about. But for both of them, there was this kind of sight and vision. And in some ways, those were not the same things. And in other ways, it was a process of transformation.
And it really brings to mind, like when I think about Dr. Ambedkar, Jyotibai and Savitribai Phule, and Ayodhyadas, they were anti-caste thinkers that really they wrote deeply and profoundly about the pain and violence. And in fact, I remember there's a line in Jyotibai Phule's book Gulamgiri where he says even the rocks would cry when they would see how caste oppressed people have been treated. And to me, that really inspired my own thinking about the earth being a witness to our suffering. Our own fellow humans who are dehumanizing us in our dominator systems don't see us. But we have to see ourselves into being, whether it's music, whether it's cultural practice. And I think for Dr. Ambedkar and Ayodhyadas, Buddhism was also a huge part of that, because they wanted to reclaim a religious tradition that could resist Brahmanism.
Yes.
That was the heart of, what set up the caste system, but something that also returned with an ethical ownership of our own integrity and our own relationship to the divine, which is why they were so passionate about being Buddhists and being anti-caste. And so it seems that this idea of poison into power is the reclamation of dignity and the reclamation of the things that make us human in the face of those dominator systems, you know? Um,
Yes. That
yeah.
makes so much sense to me. And I love that. I feel like Black Buddhists, those of us who practice, those of us who aspire, those of us who don't necessarily connect to the tradition, that we have so much to learn from anti-caste Buddhists. I feel like that conversation is for me the cutting edge conversation. That these ideas, these ways of being, these ways of seeing have already in many ways taken place from our forebears who are Dalit anti-caste Buddhists. And it's incumbent upon us to know and to study and to learn about how the Buddhist tradition serves present tense, past tense as well, serves that movement. I'm excited for this conversation. Ongoing.
And it really, you know, and I think the flip side of that was is that as someone who was a Dalit American and really yearned for Sangha, and I was repeatedly turned away from, you know, American Sanghas who actually, you know, were practicing a form of Buddhist lineages that was deracinated, but also decastified because of, you know, the genocide that actually kind of shuttered, you know, Buddhist practice in India for a period of time. And then, of course, it went around the world. But the origin story of Buddha's understanding of suffering being a direct confrontation to dominator systems, I felt that I saw it most clearly articulated by Black Buddhists. And so, you know, whether it was Tina Turner or Bell Hooks, or, you know, Alice Walker, or really beautifully put by, you know, Io, in her book, you know, about Black Buddhism. I just feel like there's a political home that we understand Sangha to be, because we don't try to, you know, gloss over suffering. It's not something existential on a mountain. It's about what are we doing to each other as humans and to other species in the earth through these dominator systems. And that really brings me to another part of the book where you really talk about Audre Lorde's charge, you know, we must speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. And that
Yes.
call feels deeply resonant with Dr. Ambedkar's insistence on freedom of the mind and the necessity of struggle in the face of social tyranny. And in the context of so much state violence, because you write obviously about Palestine and apartheid and the struggle of enslaved Black Americans in your book. And so, what does that mean to you in terms of speaking out, and how does this become an ethical and spiritual question?
It's a hard question. And something else I talk about in that first chapter when I'm speaking about the genocide and making the connection to systemic oppression of people of African descent in the United States and other regions that were impacted by the transatlantic trade of enslaved peoples is it involves some risk. And there is, for someone like me who grew up exiled from my family of origin, there's always an inner negotiation of wanting desperately to be safe and also feeling deeply compelled to advocate for people who are invisible in the house of power. So it's always a both and I can feel that's the edge of my practice, is that calling out. And I'll just say for me personally, because I have taken such a clear stance on behalf of Palestinians and feel like that's primarily, not exclusively, to whom I'm accountable when we're talking about mass displacement, when we're talking about occupation and theft of land and dehumanizing of a whole people's present tense. Because of that, I have actually made some harder decisions personally. And one of them is to not return to teaching in the academy when there's so much silencing. And some of that's my own stuff, because I would worry about bringing risk to my institution if I did speak out and I was associated with it. And some of it is I mean, the realities of this administration coming down on people like me. So part of my own risk is deciding, yes, I'll keep speaking and I am going to be more financially precarious. I'll work as an independent scholar, at least for the foreseen future. But it is that commitment to speaking and on some level personally saying, whatever I risk is nothing compared to the people who are actually suffering under this right-wing Israeli rule. And I'm certainly not alone, and I don't think I'm doing anything particularly unique, but I am making some really clear decisions about deciding to speak, even if there's a cost to it. And right now, there absolutely is a cost, and I still feel like that's minimal in the face of such magnitude of suffering.
And it's really a tremendous thing because when you think about Black struggle and Dalit struggle, there really is kind of this turning point, especially after the end of World War II, where you saw post-colonial states. And, and that's really the formation of India. And, at least with Dr. Ambedkar, he wrote he was the architect of the Indian Constitution. And so, unlike the US Constitution, which is a settler colonial document, this was the first legal document written to manage a nation state in all of South Asia, written by a caste oppressed person. So there is a huge commitment to the rule of law that comes from Dalit people. And I think, there's this exchange that happened between Dr. Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois, as Du Bois was leading, advocacy by Black Americans at the League of Nations. So there's a powerful internationalism, I think, that happens between these communities. But I think, and we see that again at the World Conference Against Racism. And I was thinking a lot about your solidarity work, because in the World Conference Against Racism, while the United States and Israel and India were trading behind closed doors, not to recognize the plight of the Palestinian people, not to recognize caste, and not to recognize the call for reparations, in the streets, Dalits were playing Parai drums, asking for freedom with keffiyehs around their neck as Palestinians were dancing with us in the streets alongside BIPOC communities. So our vision of mutual solidarity, where our liberations are linked, is always going to be in opposition to nation states that do not see freedom as their goals. And in fact, now we're seeing the failure of the nation state, which is an even more important place. But as we've all gone through a collective witnessing of genocide with what's happened in Palestine, and obviously with ICE and all of the ongoing tragedies we're seeing with the war in Iran and such, there's no question that anger is part of a process. And I feel like Buddhists often don't know how to tend with anger, but this is why I loved what you spoke about, because you wrote about anger can be about a signal a signal of injustice. And then you brought in James Baldwin's warning that hatred can become a destructive force that consumes a person from within. And this really, made me make a connection to Ayodhya, who really talked about, while Dalits have been kind of trapped by the duplicitous clamor of religion, the Buddha emphasized the unfalsifiable message of love. And so I wanted you to speak a little bit about, how do you understand the difference between anger as moral clarity and hatred as destruction? And how can we imagine a resistance rooted in truth and love rather than in dehumanization?
Yes, that was one of the hardest chapters to write, and for me, one of the most fruitful. And I had to work through some of my own stuff because, as you're saying, anger is challenging. It's hard to feel fully, and yet the practice is to do just that. And I do feel that both Baldwin and Audre Lorde guide us. And they both actually have very similar ways of talking about hatred and anger. Both said that hatred is that it's destructive, it's corrosive, that it does something to the human person, the human heart. And Baldwin in particular goes deep into what it did to his stepfather, the man he called his father. And and for both writers, anger is generative. And Baldwin in particular talked about the fact that anger arises from an examined life. And if you even superficially examine this life, our lives, the world around us, of course you feel anger. But it's something that helps us to see more clearly. It's a force to be generative. And for Baldwin, anger was always connected to love for Black people. I find that so beautiful and so important that to be angry as a result of the oppression of our people is to be angry out of love. And he has this wonderful quote that is everywhere. Love takes off the masks we know we cannot live within, and fear we cannot live without. And I might be misspeaking, but essentially, love takes off the masks and helps us to be more intimately connected, and also helps us to see more clearly. And so to honor our anger, to see anger as a teacher, to feel the weight of anger that arises from injustice is actually to be someone who is living an examined life. And that's what we're called to do and to be.
And that really makes me think of something I was thinking about in my book, The Trauma Cast, is that one of the really hard parts of these dominator systems for the bodies of the oppressed is that we're told that we cannot have reactions to our dehumanization. So, we're supposed to go to work despite our people being lynched and murdered. And we're not supposed to flinch. We're not supposed to grieve. We're just supposed to serve capital and those in the dominant castes, whether racial or otherwise. And so to actually have an emotive reaction and to hold it and be embodied in it is actually a beautiful form of resistance. And that is also, I think, something I think about with Audre Lorde's like commitment to how do we tend to the pain of racial systems. And I know that she wrote about how pain may be unavoidable, but suffering can be intensified or de-escalated by how we relate to it. And so, and Dr. Ambedkar has this really beautiful line where he says, freedom of mind is the real freedom. A
Yeah.
person whose mind is not free, though he may not be in chains, is still a slave, not a free man. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how oppression works on the inner life, and your reflection on Audre Lorde's ideas about meeting pain without being overtaken by it.
Yes, actually, I'm going to bring in another luminary, Steve Biko, who says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. That's what came to mind as you were just talking. And for Audre Lorde, I know it's so powerful. For Audre Lorde, in that practice of freedom, what she says over and over again is that everything is meant to be useful, even pain. I feel like actually this is why we need James Baldwin and Audre Lorde to translate the Dharma for us in this particular moment, in this context, in this time, is because they took suffering, they took pain so seriously. They parsed it, they knew it, they were intimate with it. Audre Lorde in particular, in reiterating that message for us that everything is meant to be used, nothing is meant to be wasted, talks about this one experience of living in an older home, and at one moment, this was on Staten Island, a window fell on her arm. It was on her arm for 7 minutes, and she talks about this excruciating experience of being trapped. She says, I had options. I could gnaw off my arm, but the truth is, if I could bear it, if I could figure out how to breathe through it, how to move through it, she said, the intensity will change, the pain changes. And she said, that 7 minutes taught me so much, that I have this capacity to bear and to move through it. For her, that life-changing event, which was an experience of pain, was so transformative because she could say, okay, this is happening. I can have anxiety about it, I can resist it, but if I choose those routes, I will intensify the pain. I will actually make it real suffering. Or I can transform it. And she says, inevitably it will change. The question is, can I have agency over how it changes, over how I work with it? And she took that lesson and applied it to every aspect of life. You could see it as her writing evolves, as she assumes this stature as a mother warrior, as she reclaims so many aspects of her identity. Nothing is meant to be wasted. And in the book, I connect it to this tale. It's an early Buddhist teaching called the Tale of Two Arrows. And what the Dharma teaches us is that there is pain. We also learn this in the First Noble Truth. There is pain in life. But the second arrow in this Tale of Two Arrows is that of swirling or devolving into anxiety, the mental collapse, if you will, of you could say spiraling and not having a capacity to meet the suffering with skill. So it's really a question of skillful suffering. And Baldwin, if it's okay to bring him into this particular aspect, even though we are focusing on Audre Lorde, but Baldwin too talked about, people who cannot suffer can never grow up. And what he's telling us is that you actually can learn to suffer. And this is when Baldwin's talking about lynchings and the fact that we can't protect our families, like deep, like soul-wrenching experiences. And then Baldwin says people who cannot suffer can never grow up. And this idea that we can meet the pain that comes at us with some skill and not devolve or be controlled by it is such an important message. But if I heard the Buddha say that as a prince who lived 2,600 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, whatever, okay. What does he know about my life or Black life or anybody's life? And, it just didn't resonate. But when I heard Baldwin and Lorde say that, say, yes, there is pain. And yes, it lands on some bodies. It lands on some people disproportionately. It's heavier for some people than it is for others. There are causes and conditions. And it is absolutely the case that life is harder for some of us due to the dominator systems you've talked about and that we're referencing. And we can bear it and we can transform it. And what Baldwin says is we can assume a kind of unshakable authority because we have this capacity to meet our pain with skill.
And I really just want people to sit with what that means to skillfully suffer, because this is a time of deep pain for our nation and the world. And it really, I think one of the things I took away from your book was that part of having skillful means with suffering is that we don't metabolize it by ourselves. That we metabolize collectively so that the process becomes a source of power rather than despair. And one question that I had was that how do you see gender being a critical part of this discourse? Because you really cite mother warriors and your own journey around this. And so I really want to bring that up before we go to our last question.
Yes. I'll be fully transparent. So in Buddhism, I didn't put this in the book, but I do talk about this publicly when I'm doing readings and doing Q&A. In Buddhism, it's actually throughout many different lineages, or what we call turnings of the wheel. We have this image of a bird. And so one wing of the bird is called insight, and the other wing of the bird is called compassion. And so it's talked about differently, but essentially we get this in early Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism. We get this image of insight and compassion and practices that go along with it. And for me, Baldwin provided so much insight. And Audre Lorde, in my experience of her, provided a way forward. There was something transcendent. Like, yes, we have to learn how to swim in these waters. And we can also imagine, we can dream, we can envision something else. And what she leads us through in her essay Eye to Eye, which is also subtitled Hatred Black women, hatred, and angers. She leads us into this self-mothering, which he talks about can then very naturally be extended outward. I do think that maternal image, while it doesn't resonate for everyone, and there are many of us, and I'm actually one of those folks who have really struggled in our relationships with our mothers, it can be a hard image or even language to interface with. But what she offers, I think, is that wing of compassion as a kind of practice. And her actual practice was highly gendered. She embraced West African deities who were both female bodied and also non binary. And in embracing these, what she called mother goddesses of us all, in embracing that, she embraced, figures that had rivers streaming from their breasts, and just this kind of fullness of the maternal figure. And I think for Audre Lorde, it was important to embrace and also to name the very different experiences that female-bodied people experience in our culture. And she named this also in the Black Liberation Movement. And both she and Baldwin, we haven't talked about this yet, but both of them identified as, our language today is queer, but gay and lesbian, and they moved in those worlds. They were fully out and fully self-embracing in those identities, and yet also in many venues rejected for those identities. And for Audre Lorde, it was not just queerness, but it was also how women were differently treated. And in the one encounter she and Baldwin had over approximately 5 hours in which they had a public conversation, they actually didn't see eye to eye. They didn't meet each other. Baldwin couldn't really hear her. Baldwin talked about a dream, and he's talking about Martin Luther King, and everybody he references is male-bodied. And Audre Lorde says, actually, I was never part of that dream. And she's talking about the exploitation of Black women, including at the hands of Black men. So it's to say that gender is, I think, both something to name and recognize and how certain bodies are treated differently, and also in her vision, the female body is something to celebrate. It's something to embrace and to see as beautiful and life-giving. And her capacity to evolve spiritual practices, for me, was just extraordinary. It was linked to her idea or her concept of erotic power. And then, yes, this image of the mother warrior, this protective being, I really resonated with that.
And, in many ways, I think, especially as a Dalit woman who was trained by BIPOC feminists in the United States, I think the power of the Combahee Collective really empowered me to think in an intersectional way about caste and gender. And I think it's one of the reasons why Equality Labs was founded as a Dalit feminist and Ambedkarite organization. And there's so many ancestors we draw into that conversation, like from a Buddhist perspective, I think about the story of Matangi, who's often, when people are learning little Buddhist parables, they often learn about it in she's the woman at the well, who has this very powerful experience meeting Ananda, because she's an untouchable. So nobody talks to her, nobody wants food or water. And he comes up to her and he's like, can you give me something to drink? And she's like, are you talking to me? You want water from me? And so she's so shocked that someone spoke to her in a human way. She gives him the water, but then she follows him. And she thinks she's in love with him. And he takes her back to the Sangha. And when they finally meet the Buddha's like, you're not really in love with him. You're actually in love with being seen as a human. And I think when you were talking about Audre Lorde, like exploring, these African feminine deities, I think for many of us who face that intersectionality of facing the dominator system of race or caste, but also that of patriarchy, we do not see ourselves in the sacred, and we have to actively cultivate that. So whether it's figures like Matangi, or when you said mother warrior, I thought of Pulan Devi, the bandit queen,
Oh, wow.
who
Yeah.
was a child bride who was kidnapped against her will. And then she herself became a bandit. And though she was raped, she actually went back and then, held her rapist to accountability, and then eventually became a parliamentarian fighting for the rights of the oppressed. And I felt that warrior energy while I was hearing you. And then I also think about so many of the Dalit feminist founders of Equality Labs and the work that Dalit women do every day. We see ourselves in the sacred, we see ourselves in the political, and we see ourselves as part of weaving this future alongside other BIPOC feminists. So I know we're running short, but I want to ask this last question, because I think part of metabolizing suffering collectively is actually looking at the way that Buddhism teaches us that we are not isolated individuals, but deeply interconnected beings with each other species, and the earth. And your book points us to a theory of collective karma, one in which social conditions and political structures and shared ideas shape individual and collective life. And I'm just wondering, can you share a little bit what your understanding of collective karma is, and how does a commitment to that deepen our responsibility to confront state violence and dominator systems, especially as it relates to Palestine, caste apartheid, and other struggles for freedom?
Yes, the carceral systems. So I know we're short on time, but I'll just say it took me 3.5 years, but I wrote an article in January in which I finally asked and answered that question. So basically, what I want to convey, kind of taking some ideas that scholars will write tombs about, say we're all shaped by language. And actually I have a friend, Jessica Zhu, who you also know, who has been very influential in helping me understand collective karma and how narratives are passed down, how language, how ideas are passed down generation through generation. And we could think of it just with language, although it's much broader than that, and just think we're introduced to words that have weight, that have meaning, and we inherit that. So that's one way we could think of collective karma. Karma refers to thoughts, words, and actions. So what gets passed down, what influences us that is part of the collective. And I think one of the most extraordinary aspects of our own agency is that we can take some of those ideas and reshape them. So just by example, I'm not saying anything new. Critical race theorists have also said this. We can take the word black, which, Malcolm X sitting in prison read through the dictionary when he came upon this word black. All of these terrible words and associations were associated with the word black. And then he looked at the word white in the dictionary, it's purity and goodness and what have you. And then think of what happened in the aftermath of the Black Power movement, or during, not even in the aftermath, but black, which had been associated with defilement, became beautiful. Black is beautiful, and the hair that had been defiled and straightened with a hot comb and lye and processors became something worth celebrating. When Audre Lorde refused to process her hair, just by example, but just the way in which words that have been passed down, language that has been passed down, we inherit that, and yet we're not beholden to that. We can reframe, we can reshape, we can reassociate, and we have real agency also when we think of collective karma. But it's also not an individual thing. We do need each other. We need to be part of these movements. We need overlapping structures and ways of being. I'm thinking the feminist movement, the Black feminist movement, the womanist movement, the Black arts movement. We need each other, and it needs to come from different avenues. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of thinking about dominator systems and my own work on the carceral system, or thinking about occupation and genocide, thinking about the anti-caste movement in response to this Brahmanist system, is ideas come first. The institutions come second. So if we take that language and those ideas and we reshape them, the institutions, the structures will follow. That's the power of ideas. That's also the power of language. But we're not just victims to what's been handed to us. We have so much agency, and that too is our collective karma. I really believe in that. Even if it's slow and even if we don't see the fruit of our labor in our lifetimes, it matters.
Absolutely. And it's a very distinct difference of understanding karma than that of the Hindu scriptures that set up caste, because again, for folks that are joining us and learning about anti-caste struggle, you know, the caste system itself was formed on this carceral idea that caste oppressed people were sentenced to be untouchable or spiritually defiling because of crimes in a past life. And so there, it was a justification not to allow for organizing around people's conditions. But I think, so for a very long time, actually, Rima, I never used the term karma, dharma, you name it, right? But I think this idea of collective karma, that we're actually all collectively responsible as agents to deal with historical harm, that really allows for a different understanding. It's not one body, one crime, one sentence, and also a justification for dehumanization. It's that we have a collective karma to heal and actually be and intervene with each other, which
Yeah.
I really loved, and so I think that's like a beautiful entry into our Q&A. And guys, I know that for the many folks that are on here, there's some really beautiful comments, as well as some folks that have already started to use the Q&A to drop some initial questions. And I really wanted to pass it to my colleague Ellis, who is going to navigate the Q&A, because we want to hear from you guys, and we want to make sure that you get a chance to sink in the beautiful deliciousness with Dr. Rima's intellect and Buddhist practice in this wonderful book. So Ellis, I'm going to pass it to you for the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, T. Yeah, and thank you both so much for this discourse. It has been absolutely a privilege to be a witness to it, and thank you for all of your insights and um, yeah, learnings that you shared with us today. Yeah, and I don't know if you caught it, but we've had some really lovely comments, people asking if this can be recurring and getting plus ones on that. So lovely, I plus one that myself. But yeah, we have some questions in the Q&A, and I think the one that came in first, Pramila, she's talking about, I'll just generalize it so we can try to get through some of these, but talking about working for, an organization that, for instance, doesn't support the Palestinian struggle, or you can generalize that to, not sharing values or political views or worldviews. And how do you what insights can you offer of like reaching out to folks who you don't agree with on such important matters? To build understanding, to see what can be done. And it's not directed to anyone, but if anyone feels called, jump right in.
Thenmozhi, do you want me to respond or? Oh, Jessica's with us.
I know. I was just
Oh,
saying
lovely.
hi to her.
Awesome.
Rima, I think you should take it away.
Okay. I will say, first and foremost, that when what image, we're just at such a point at this moment in time, but I knew very little about occupation. I think also what I was exposed to in this country, I actually see my myopia and my ignorance as so shocking given actually what has taken place for 7.5 decades. The first people I read in trying to understand were all Jewish, were Jewish scholars and journalists. It was so important for me to just try to figure out what was going on. And those were the voices that were most accessible. The reason I bring that up is because there are so many Jewish writers, thinkers, activists, people who take very seriously their Jewish identity, who find these amazing ways of bringing forth their theologies plural, and making the connection to why the oppression, the occupation, and the genocide, the dehumanization of Palestinians is something to take on as their spiritual commitment. And what I would say is being steeped in those voices and then talking to people who might weaponize this term anti-Semitic, I think is important. So I do find myself first and foremost accountable to Palestinians and Palestinian voices. And I traveled to Palestine to build relationships because I didn't exactly know where to start in the United States. Now I have more friendships and more connections. But initially, the people I was in closest proximity to were people who practice their Jewish faith and who are speaking out. So those are the voices, even if you first and foremost hold yourself accountable to Palestinians, if you're in conversations and the term anti-Semitism or being seen as anti-Semitic is being weaponized against you, I would bring forth the voices. And I mean, there are so many. For example, you can start with Jewish Currents. I mean, actually, I've been trying to keep up to date. I see Jessica's put into the chat Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's somebody I'm in a group with, actually, like a Buddhist pro-Palestinian group, and he's very active. There are actually many, many Jewish Buddhists who are speaking about the rights and the humanity of Palestinians from both a Jewish and a Buddhist perspective. But that's where I would lead, and you would be in good company. I mean, some of the fiercest activists I've met in this country are Jewish and fully embrace their self-identity and are the loudest voices saying, end the occupation today. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what has served me well when I've been in really hard conversations.
Mm. Thank you, Rima.
Yeah.
So I want to do a quick time check for everyone. A little behind the scenes for you all. Then Maury and Rima were like, we're totally going over.
We did say
Because
that.
there's so much here, and there's so much here. So to everybody joining us, if you're down, they've actually agreed to go over a little bit longer to try to get a few more of these questions in. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but are you all open to at least one more question, two more questions, or would you like to move on, T?
Oh no, we should.
We're rolling.
We're here,
Yeah.
we're in it. And I really want to shout out Professor Shaista Patel, who is another Dalit professor who's joined us. And I really want to make sure we get to her question. And there's so many beautiful people here. If you want to ask a question, throw it into the Q&A and we'll go till we close that piece. But
Okay,
I
cool.
will say before we go on, and Alice, this is for you. This is, we did have this conversation for Dalit History Month and also as a drive to also support the work and really important conversations like this that we hosted Equality Lab. So while we're staying on, we'll drop in a donation link. And if you haven't already donated, please consider making a small or even recurring donation because it allows us to kind of create these kind of provoking and compassionate conversations that allows us to knit the movement relationships and kin that we need at this time to build what comes next, but that said, Ellis, let's go with the next question.
Great.
Yes, I just read it.
Yeah, and Professor Patel's question is actually next. So this is for Rima, and I'll just read this one verbatim because it's multifaceted. So how do you think about the contradictions of people we look up to? Very relevant. For example, in recent years, we've learned about how Lorde Zionist stance and how June Jordan and she had a split when it came to Palestine. How do you reconcile that with drawing on her work and also being so fiercely in solidarity with Palestinians? Thanks again.
It's such an important question, and I'll just say one of the most generative processes of writing this book was when I wrote this chapter on Audre Lorde's spirituality and I learned so much, especially from secondary scholars. And I went back to her book, which she calls a biomythography, which is Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. And smack in the middle of Zami, she celebrates the founding of the state of Israel. And it was like a dagger in the heart for me. Oh my God, it was so painful to read that. It's one line in this otherwise fabulous, amazing text. And it was like a dagger in the heart. And then, yes, I know most about the split with June Jordan from Alexis Pauline Gumbs's biography on Audre Lorde, which came out, I think now about a year and a half ago, give or take. And also Alexis Pauline Gumbs has written in other spheres about their split. And I will say, and this is not at all dismissing or marginalizing Audre Lorde's views, and again, that line smack in the middle of Zami was, for me, just extraordinary and painful, so painful. And she was somewhat complicated, let me rephrase. I would say Audre Lorde was somewhat nuanced with regards to Palestinians. So yes, there was a split. She and June Jordan did not repair on this issue. Part of it as well is that Audre Lorde maintained friendships with Zionists, Audre and Rich, and that too was so painful. I mean, my ignorance on the occupation for me is still a bit mind-blowing, but for years, decades, I memorized Audre and Rich's poems, and I knew her work intimately. I have probably every volume of poetry in my household, and yet she was a Zionist lesbian poet. And I didn't know that until much later, but then I went back, and Audre Lorde maintained a lifelong friendship with her and with others. So it is very nuanced. And what I have chosen, this is my own parsing, and I think maybe some of it is being trained as an ethicist, in which for years and years I worked with complicated texts that not only offered a way forward, but were also harmful in how they were articulated, is to say yes and. So in this case, in working with Audre Lorde's work, what I primarily was attempting to do is to hear her emphasis on not self-silencing and her advocacy to speak, and to know that within the second generation feminist movement, she had really complicated relationships with a lot of women, and her way forward was to try to work through differences and to honor differences and to say it is a huge difference. And I am not someone who has maintained close friendships with people who support Zionism, and I've had to be really clear. I've actually lost some really important friendships. So I have not, for me, it's too raw, it's too stark. But I also don't want to write off Audre Lorde or dismiss the importance of her work because she maintained those relationships. And she has said things that would, if I were in the same room, allow me to also use her words to challenge her. So I want to say that it's nuanced, and it's not an either or, and it's also painful. Yes, I could say more about Baldwin too, but I'll stop there.
Could you though speak more about Baldwin, just so that we have you in this
Oh,
opportunity?
yes.
I think
Okay.
people want to definitely hear that.
Okay. Baldwin, for me, was so much more clear, and I actually took my cues from Baldwin. Oh, and I will be able to read the chat more fully when I stop speaking. But for Baldwin, his clarity on Israel was such an illumination. It was such a beacon. And also the way that he talked about relationships in the United States with Jewish communities, the friendships he had made, shopkeepers and landlords he experienced in Harlem. I mean, he had a whole analysis that was really important for me to engage as I was learning about occupation and as the genocide was unfolding. And yet, too, Baldwin is really complicated for me. I mean, in all honesty, read his fiction and can feel some horror. So Baldwin and Lorde both are not straightforward. I don't take everything they've said or written and say that's my way forward. I have to really engage them and also feel the horror fully and recognize it for what it is, and also say they are my luminaries and I can fight with them. Not like, I can struggle. That's what I mean. I can engage and feel the nuance and also reject some of the things they say. It's not a wholesale, they said it, therefore I must adopt it or believe it. I can really engage them in complicated ways, and I do. And that doesn't take away the fact that they've offered so much. And I think it's important to take seriously the ways in which they might say something deeply harmful, or maybe have had actions they committed while they were alive that were deeply harmful, to not ignore that or to bypass that.
I also think, Rima, one of the things that I really think about is that, Dr. Ambedkar has this idea that like this was a movement, the movement for liberation and human dignity wasn't going to stop with him. And that in fact, everyone is responsible for moving the caravan of justice forward. And I think of it kind of like a holy fire, where it's like we're going to do our best in our embodied experiences. And Alka, I think you really said that well in the chat, is that these are people that are human, that are part of a particular moment in time. And I think that there are choices people sometimes make, especially around Zionism and Hindu nationalism, for that matter, which are about the fears people have being in an individual body against a systemic violence. Sometimes it's like willfully ignoring them. Sometimes it's about being afraid of being defunded, deplatformed. When you think about the terror that's happening in academic institutions and workplaces, and the ways that we see anti-Semitism under the IRA definition being
Yeah.
used to
Yeah.
track, harass, surveil, make people lose their jobs, make them lose their funding. It's a terror campaign. It's just like the Red Scare, you know? And I
Yeah.
think in the face of that, individual bodies and have an embodied experience of fear. And we obviously are not Audre Lorde. We don't know what she was thinking when she made those choices. But I think what I use in my mind to understand this moment is that image of the Buddha holding the door. He may have reached a state of enlightenment, but he chooses not to go because he wants to hold the door open for as many people that can find freedom and possibility. And so I think in that context, I think we understand the complexity and we learn from it and we commit and can make different choices. And in doing that, we hold the door open for the connections between oppressed peoples so that our liberations are linked, and I feel, the piece that's most important is, and I think this goes back to turning poison into power. I think we want to keep our hearts supple in the face of violence. And when they get hardened because we're not able to see a path of compassion, even backward in time to figures who are dear to us but made mistakes, we then become so solid and stuck. We can't be nimble about how we can transform their legacies in the ways that we change our behavior, in the ways that we change our actions and possibilities. And so I think it's not just about the legacy of the leaders in the past, it's how we use their legacy forward. And what you said about Audre was that if I was in the same room with her, I would use her words to perhaps
Yes.
change her mind, right?
I would
And
hold her accountable.
well, and also, you are a dream of liberation. Audre would have been so proud of, you
Oh,
know.
thank you for saying
And
that.
I think that I feel her spirit with us, just as I feel all of the other Dalit spirits that we've ancestors we've invoked, and for them to be taken out of their context and be in this moment, and to hear how much we treasure them, and an experience that they didn't feel all the time in their real lives, they probably could have made different choices if they had the love and the enormity of the people here that have been transformed by their work.
Mm.
So healing is forward and backward in time. And I think my approach is really about that healing piece. I
Mm.
hope for healing for Audre from some of the choices that she made. And I feel like our actions to commit to a different path are the best way we honor their legacies, you know.
Mm.
Thank you
Oh,
both.
Um,
that's beautiful.
so Ellis, I know there's a bunch of other questions. Do you think you could do the superstar action of compiling them so that we have one last question before we close?
Uh, Wait, compiling them into one question?
Well, you know
Uh,
what you could do is you can just read them out and then Rima can respond to them.
okay. Rima, what do you think? A rapid fire?
Of all of the questions, I'm just
Yes,
taking a
but
quick look.
you don't have to necessarily answer them one by one, but maybe you could do a compiled answer to what they're speaking to.
Okay,
Okay.
so we're talking one question is what does it take to love those who oppress us, vis-a-vis caste and race? Um, Someone asking about whether the word karma is triggering, and I assume why. Um, and Lorde spoke of silence being used as a tool of oppression, and how do you reconcile her call to speak out with the Buddhist and Quaker value of finding truth in stillness? And just, yeah, some thank yous and comments is the last one. So
Okay.
kind of different questions there, but feel free to take what works.
Okay. Well, I'll just say, in terms of the question about loving people who oppress us, I think for me, I am, of course, just saying this from my own perspective and taking very seriously both Baldwin and Lorde's guidance, but also as a practitioner, it's much more important to not hate than to try to make myself love or to veer towards something that where I'm trying to generate an emotion or something to that effect. So going back to the part of the conversation in which we talked about the difference between hatred and anger, I think it's important for me when I feel deep hatred towards people who are actively oppressing me or other people who are in deep suffering to work with my hatred very intentionally. I would say it's tremendous emotional labor, and it's labor I take on because of my Buddhist practice and my values. And I personally don't want to be deformed by the hatred. I have felt tremendous hatred these last couple of years. I mean, deep, deep, like it takes over my body kind of hatred. So my way of working with that hatred is to allow myself to feel it, and then I would say somewhat intellectually but also emotionally, to be reminded, to remind myself to actually very intentionally engage with the fact that all people are a result of their causes and conditions, and to take a step back and to try to understand those conditions. I still think people have agency. I'm not saying we're just passive results of our conditions, but to try to understand how someone might get to the point of acting with such hatred and also such impunity. I don't always still understand, and I think I can spiral when, going back to that tale of the two arrows. Some of my suffering is I will be just tremendously confused. Like, I don't even understand what's happening with Iran and I mean, I don't understand it. And so that's also something for me to work with, but to be really present with what's going on and to not try to generate love as much as to try to have some understanding, some sense of, okay, this is what the conditions are. This is what led to this moment in time. I also really appreciate this question on silence being used as a tool of oppression. And I actually have done some writing about the difference between silencing and claiming silence. And so I feel like it's important and really incumbent upon us to call out when we're being silenced, when silence is being used as a tool of oppression. We'll say in some of our Dharma communities and what we call mainline Buddhist institutions, there is a lot of silencing, and it is important to call that out. You know, just by example, I was asked to teach a class on the Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde at Spirit Rock a few years ago while I was writing the book. And it came to my attention they had put out a statement that I found absolutely egregious in an attempt to respond to the genocide. I was so I was so angry. That's actually mild. Actually, I cite this in my first chapter, this statement they put out. And I knew from listening to teachers who are friends that teachers were being told not to talk about the genocide, that practitioners were being told not to wear the keffiyeh in the meditation hall. That is silencing. And yet there is silence that is generative. And so to make a distinction, to refuse to get in line when silence is being used as a weapon, but also to say, yes, there is truth in stillness and in silence, and that actually that level of stillness, that way of being, can bring us to speech. Audre Lorde has this really beautiful way of talking about moving from silence into language and action. And I think that is something that we also might follow or we might embrace, but that the silence is generative and quite beautiful and also different from being silenced.
And the only thing I would add to your beautiful response there, Rima, is that for me, what I find generative about silence and meditative practice is something that you wrote about in your book, which is, how do we skillfully suffer? And in some ways, and this is like for people that are like new to Buddhist thinking, Buddhists always talk about skillful means. Like this is like our jam, So you might be like, why do they keep talking about skillful things? Like, are they like all about hobbies? Like, no. That skillful means framework is really about how do we do things with the most intention and thoughtfulness so that we're not bringing harm either to ourselves and other people, and not moving from a place of reactivity. And when I really came across this framework of skillful means, I really loved it because it gives us different tools than what we are trained under dominator systems. Like dominator systems want us to be in a constant state of reactivity and a soup of our cortisol so that we're not able to actually be intentional, strategic communities. And I think with anger and with violence and with grief, we have so many unskillful ways to experience that in our bodies that lead to substances or lead to treating other people badly or treating ourselves badly. But what I find really valuable about silence and meditative practice is that it's the distinction of saying something like, I'm angry or I have anger. And
Yeah.
that ability to say, I have anger, really means you are not defined by a reactive emotion.
Yeah.
And that space is actually an infinite space of different opportunities and possibilities that can be skillful, strategic, collective, and healing. Because, when we think about Ruth King, who I know is a mentor of yours as well, and, she was very inspirational in terms of how her model of rain is really used to kind of look at racial, racial violence. I always think like how you create that space using that rain model, the end of it is nurture. When we have an experience of dehumanization, we're never trained under dominator systems to nurture ourselves in reaction to a trigger. So I think of silence as very nutritive, as a
Yes.
way for us to be able to understand how we can move thoughtfully, centering healing and safety for ourselves first. Because like I remember like when there would be atrocity and I'd be the only Dalit atrocity, and I would be a Dalit person in a room full of dominant caste people, I would be so upset and I'd want to say something. And my
Mm.
reaction was, I have to say something right now.
Mm.
And of course, some of those people didn't want to hear it and they would immediately cause me harm. And then I was also harmed because I was risking myself needlessly. But I just had a reactivity because it was so painful to see that lynching or to see that rape and to
Yeah.
see that headline and to see these like cries of violence in our community and no one acting.
Yeah.
And I think the space of silence and meditative practice in whatever religious traditions, you know, Sufis have a meditative practice, Buddhists have a meditative practice, Christians and Quakers, as the person who answered this question, we seek solace in communion with nature and our inner wisdom, because that is actually how we will survive as a species.
Mm.
And fundamentally, I think this is part of the origin of this event, is that the luminaries that you really highlighted for ourselves are a reminder of how many gifts we have when we turn inward and pull from our ancestral wisdom towards freedom, you know?
Yes.
So really want to thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Rima, and all folks that joined us online. Before people go, I know Ellis has an ask, and Ellis, I think we did a really good job at staying within the lines here. So I'm going to pass it back to you. But I just want to wish healing to everyone. It's been such a beautiful conversation. So Ellis, back to you.
Sure, and maybe I'll pop on camera. Hi, everybody. Ellis again. I want to thank you both again for bringing us into your hearts and minds and into the work. It was so lovely to hear you in dialogue. Thank you to everyone who came to be in community with us to learn. So many supporters actually came to the event tonight, people that have supported Equality Labs in one way or another. Our genuine, deep gratitude to you. And also, there are some folks that maybe were new to you or you're still getting to know us. Very lovely to meet you. Welcome. This is a great time if you have the means, if you are looking for a way to get involved in this moment, in this movement. We are looking for donors. We're looking for support. There's a lot going on in our world right now that we're showing up to with a strong back and a full spirit. And we're ready to do what needs doing, but we do need your support. We need you with us to be able to do that. And so, a humble request, if you have the means, a gift that's meaningful to you means the world to us. So,
Mm.
I'm going to ask my colleague to drop a link to donate to the work. If you feel called, again, much appreciation and gratitude to those who can support, and all the things that you do out there in the world that are so much beyond, donations and coming to events. We see your fullness, your full personhood, and everything that y'all do out there. So, with that, unless there's any closing comments, yes, T,
Yes,
please.
I wanted to also give a special shout out to North Atlantic Books. North Atlantic Books is Dr. Rima and my publisher. And so these two beautiful books just could not have come into the world without the amazing team of NAB. And we love you guys. Thank you for supporting us so much. Really, NAB is a special sangha for thinkers like us. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. And Dr. Rima, I want to give you the last word before we close out.
Oh, that's kind. That's beautiful. Well, I'm also so grateful, Thenmozhi and Ellis, to be with you, to everyone who joined us, and the comments, the questions. I think most of all, we hope, I speak for Thenmozhi, who I am in constant conversation with, and people in our world, that we hope that you are supported. Your liberation is bound up with ours. We, above all, are looking to our ancestors and looking to each other to find a way forward. And it matters that we have each other. And so I'm so grateful for everyone who had capacity to be with us and to engage. And also hope that you are in daily community with people who can help to nourish you. Deep bows to you all.
Jay Beam and Jay Savitri, everyone. And, really, guys, I see the call for us to do more of these. So we will. We've actually been talking about starting a Freedom Sangha at Equality Labs. So just take us through. You'll see the invites on our socials. But please just take good care and thank you all. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.